Well, hello and welcome to our next installment of this ongoing series, AP United States History and You. Now, today we tackle the Great War, its causes, its effects, secret alliances, secret messages, sinking ships, submarines, a Kaiser, an Archduke, the Black Hand, a stalemate, a ceasefire, a peace conference, and an American president who is as idealistic as he is punchable. Are you ready for war? Me too. By now, you've seen a lot of these presentations and you have your own coping mechanism coffee, tea, petting the cat, watching at 1.5 speed. Please remember, this is your only opportunity to make a written record of the things that we learn here. So if you have any telephonic devices, please switch them to the ocular position at this time and avoid toggling between different tabs on your web browser or simultaneously watching something on Netflix. This might make things go faster, but it won't improve your performance on the AP exam or in this class as a whole. So again, as I've said before, monotask. All the cool kids are doing it. Also, take note of how you are taking your notes, right? When we are together in the classroom, I'm able to look around and see who's taking excellent notes and who's merely copying down the words that pop up on the screen, and those who are sleeping and or drooling on the page. I can't see what you're doing right now. It would be creepy if I could, but I will be measuring how much you're learning. So do yourself a favor and take super detailed notes. It's a great game, and it's sweeping the nation. So let's get down to business. World War One. It's a worldwide conflagration that ensnared more nations and killed more human beings than any other conflict in history. That is, until the next one, that sequel that happened 20 years later. Indeed, so much of our understanding of the 20th century and the majority of the programming that's on the History Channel right now deals with World War II. The scale was greater, the weapons were deadlier, the evils of Nazism were even more vast than we had ever imagined in our worst nightmares, and the resolution was more definitive. And so, in the shadow of World War II, the Great War just doesn't seem so great. But it is, and it's worth talking about because you can't really understand what's going on in The Empire Strikes Back without watching Star Wars first. So let's take a trip back to a long time ago in a continent far, far away. And here's the continent. It's Europe. You'll notice that the United States is not featured on this map at all. So if today's presentation were an essay prompt, it might be this. Why did the United States not join the war in 1914, and why did it finally join the war in 1917? Can you guess the answer? I bet you can. It's complicated. A little backstory. The story of the American emergence as a regional power is truly the tale of four presidents. The first, William McKinley, is what I like to call a reluctant imperialist. It's not how he really wanted to be remembered, but imperialism was the hand he was dealt. And in truth, it's more accurate to say that he was a believer in the spheres of influence approach. That is, areas where one country is able to exert its power and influence, and where other nations sort of backed off. Central and South America were pretty much our spheres of influence, thanks to the Monroe Doctrine, and the United States respected British domination in Southeast Asia, French influence in West Africa, and so on. But perhaps the best example of this was the Open Door, which asked all the countries that wanted to pillage China to respect each other's ability and influence in certain parts of that country, and that is how the United States got a seat at the table. Of course, McKinley is probably better known for what happened in the Spanish-American War, where the United States got Cuba, at least temporarily, got Puerto Rico as a territory, and control over the Philippines, which people in the Philippines actively resisted. The United States also annexed Hawaii just for good measure, but one can sense the indecision and uncertainty in President McKinley's voice as he wrestled with what to do about the Philippines in this quotation you see here on the screen. We could not leave them to themselves. They were unfit for self-rule. There was nothing left to do but take them all and uplift them and civilize and Christianize them. And if it sounds like that's the white man's burden, it's because that's exactly how McKinley saw it, which is pretty much the opposite of how the Filipinos saw it, which explains the resulting insurrection that cost hundreds of thousands of lives before it was finally put down. Well, thanks to the Curse of Tecumseh, McKinley didn't live to see the end of the Philippine insurrection. TR, my man crush, came to office with a vision for America as an imperial power and a catchphrase: speak softly, carry a big stick, and you will go far. This was metaphorical, of course, because TR never could actually be accused of speaking softly, but the point was, if you have a big stick, that is a weapon that can do real damage, the stick does the speaking for you. In the United States' case, that stick was the United States Navy, which Roosevelt built into the so-called Great White Fleet, he used that big stick to help get the Panamanian territory away from the Colombians so that TR could get his precious canal. And then he used it again with the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, in which TR announced that the U.S. would use its Navy to serve as an international police power in the Caribbean, in order to keep the Europeans out, of course. But perhaps my favorite story about TR and the Big Stick was when he sent the Great White Fleet on a world tour as an example of what would come to be known as gunboat diplomacy. Well, as the story goes, TR wanted to announce American presence on the world stage with authority, showing off the Great White Fleet to the ports of the world, but Congress was worried that a 14-month goodwill tour would cost too much money and have no real point. TR reportedly said, "I have enough funding to send the fleet into the Pacific. If Congress wants its Navy back, it'll have to pay to bring it home." And so the fleet went around the world and did exactly what TR had intended. It showed that the United States was poised to be a legitimate world power in the 20th century. Oh, poor William Howard Taft. Pray people only remember him for being our largest president, and I, for one, am not there for the fat shaming. But he certainly didn't see the United States military in the same way that TR did. Instead, he felt that guns and ships and armies and bombs were a far more costly way of projecting power to other countries. Sure, you could blow something up, but bombs cost money, and then paying to rebuild the place that you just blew up costs even more money. Better to pursue a policy called dollar diplomacy, or, as Taft put it, substituting dollars for bullets. And his logic was this: we can essentially buy power over other countries by paying their bills for them or collecting taxes on their behalf. Like the mob boss who pays your debt, but then you owe him a favor at some unspecified time in the future. And that's what the United States would become with dollar diplomacy. That's what dollar diplomacy was. We would guarantee loans to countries in need so that they didn't have to default or get taken over by European countries. Now, in some cases, the United States had to step in and act as a protector of those territories, like in the Virgin Islands and temporarily in Nicaragua. But notice that we didn't like to use the term colony. I wonder why. We preferred instead the term protectorate. So if TR was a gunboat diplomat and Taft was a dollar diplomat, then perhaps the best way to describe President Wilson was that of a missionary diplomat. Now, what does this mean? Well, to answer that question, it's helpful to know that Woodrow Wilson was the son of a Presbyterian minister in Stanton, Virginia. And that southern, relatively rural upbringing certainly informed his racial views, which were, in a word, racist. In two words, incredibly racist. But his connection to religion led him to approach life and politics with a sort of evangelical zeal, as in, I'm on a mission from God. And that's not just a figure of speech. Take a look at these Wilson quotations. If I didn't feel that I was the chosen instrument of God, I couldn't carry on. What? The chosen instrument of God? Like Moses? Like Muhammad? Joseph Smith? John Brown? Seriously? Yes, seriously. And then how about this second quotation? I feel sorry for those who disagree with me because I know they're wrong. See what I mean? Really, really punchable. But anyway, Woodrow Wilson felt that the United States was on a holy mission to spread democracy and civilization to all the non-white parts of the world, whether they wanted it or not. So, if a country couldn't pay its debts or manage its own security, Wilson saw that as evidence that non-white countries were less civilized and less advanced. So he took up the white man's burden and he sent in troops to occupy places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Mexico. Wait, Mexico? Yes, Mexico. In the last quarter of the 19th century, Mexico took a turn toward authoritarian military rule, as the country was run by this man and his medals, Porfirio Diaz. Eventually, Mexican protesters and rebels, inspired by the American ideals of democracy and liberty, rose up and overthrew Diaz and his medals, and they were led by this man, Francisco Madero. Now, Madero believed in democracy and reform, and his hero was none other than Woodrow Wilson. So when he took over, he sought to introduce progressive changes to the country. But kids, here is a pro tip if you ever find yourself leading a revolution, and I fully expect that to happen. The way you win a revolution is first try to get foreign recognition. Now, we saw that in the American Revolution, thank you, France, and the Panamanian Revolution, thank you, United States of America. And the second way to win is you need to consolidate your power within your own borders. Now, as Woodrow Wilson's mini-me, I think we can say that Madero had no trouble getting the foreign recognition, but the problem was he couldn't consolidate his power because the military opposed him. And so, pretty quickly, Francisco Madero's government was overthrown by this man, Victoriano Huerta. By his jaunty cap, you can tell that this is a military man, much as Diaz had been. And the coup really upset Woodrow Wilson, who effectively said, "You just overthrew my mini-me." But Huerta had it even harder than Madero, because not only could he not get foreign recognition, he was opposed by not one, not two, but three different factions that opposed him. We see this man here, Venustiano Carranza, Emilio Zapata, and Pancho Villa. Now, of these three men, Wilson and the Americans thought that Carranza was the best option. But everyone, the Americans and the three revolutionaries, they were all united in wanting to get rid of Huerta. So this is why Huerta's situation was so precarious. Well, so here's the question. Is any of this the United States' business? Well, kind of. If you remember that the Roosevelt Corollary meant that we needed to act as an international police power in the region. But it became more of the United States' business in 1914 when an American ship landed at Tampico on Mexico's west coast. The crew went ashore, ostensibly looking for oil. Please remember, great navies require coaling stations, and coaling stations are where you're going to find the fuel. But they ran into some Mexican soldiers who shot at them and then eventually surrounded the Americans and arrested them in what became known as the Tampico Incident. Now, pretty much as soon as the Mexican government found out what the soldiers had done, the American sailors were released and allowed to leave the country. But when Wilson heard about this, he was, as you might guess, indignant. Some non-white military officers dared to touch and detain an American soldier, and a group of soldiers at that? Someone needs to teach this Victoriano Huerta a lesson in respect for those who are better than him. And so Wilson demanded that the Mexican government apologize, which they did, and then run an American flag up the flagpole of the Mexican government building, and then fire a 21-gun salute in honor of the United States. This was apparently too much to ask for the Mexican government, and they've refused. And when they refused the 21-gun salute, Wilson was so insulted that he had to invade Mexico. It's important to remember here we're invading a country because we're snubbed by a flag salute and a gun salute. But we totally did that, and we landed at Veracruz in 1914, in the very place where old Fuss and Feathers Winfield Scott had landed during the Mexican War in 1846. Now, Woodrow Wilson believed that the Americans would be greeted as liberators, but Mexican soldiers started shooting at those liberators, and that was surprising to all parties concerned. Now, in the end, the combination of American military force and three separate revolutionary groups did force Victoriano Huerta to abdicate. But that didn't solve the total problem, because now three factions of Mexican revolutionaries had to determine who could consolidate their power and then unite the nation now. When Huerta was in power, those three groups had followed the philosophy that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so they liked the United States, but now that Huerta was gone and the United States had chosen to support Carranza, well, now the friend of my new enemy is my new enemy. And so Pancho Villa and Zapata were both opposed to the United States of America suddenly. And this led to a remarkable episode in 1916 when Pancho Villa led a group of raiders across the U.S. border and attacked the tiny little town of Columbus, New Mexico. About 20 U.S. soldiers and civilians were killed before Pancho Villa was driven back into Mexico. But take a minute to consider the historic nature of this moment. There's only been a handful of times when the territory of the United States has been attacked or invaded. It's a pretty short list. D.C. during the War of 1812, Pearl Harbor, 9/11, and this tiny little raid in New Mexico. Well, not surprisingly, Woodrow Wilson was incensed, and so he had U.S. General Black Jack Pershing put together an expeditionary force to try to invade northern Mexico, find Pancho Villa, capture him. It did not go well. The expeditionary force spent months roaming around northern Mexico, attacking and irritating Mexican citizens, but never finding Pancho Villa. And when Pershing finally had to go back in failure to the United States, the U.S. had learned an important lesson. I call this lesson selective involvement. We can choose which conflict we want to participate in, but if our military is so weak that it can't find one person running around openly in a country right next to us, we have absolutely no business getting involved in some foreign war going on in Europe with much bigger armies and much higher casualties with almost nothing at stake for the United States. And there you have part of the answer to this first question. Why did the United States not get involved in World War I in 1914? So let's talk about the outbreak of World War I in Europe in 1914. If you remember your European history, and I'm sure you do, you might recall that the Metternich system that emerged from the Congress of Vienna following the Napoleonic Wars was based in the belief that peace could be maintained in Europe so long as there was a balance of powers. The Prussians might have a big army, but they had a weak navy, and Britain had a strong navy, but a weak army. And overall, no one country had a military that was too strong. And that's why there was relative peace in Europe over the next century. Even through the 3 wars of German unification, that didn't upset the overall balance of power because of this guy, Otto von Bismarck, and his hat. He practiced something called Realpolitik, remember that term? And that sought only to unite the Germanic peoples under one nation state rather than having it continue to exist as a bunch of weak, tiny little states like Bavaria and Brandenburg and Westphalia. But that delicate balance that Bismarck had achieved was upset when Kaiser Wilhelm II read The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. He said, in a better German accent than I can do, "Jawohl, we must be a great nation, and that means have a great navy." And so he began building that great navy. With ships, yes, of course, but also with this new technology called the Unterseeboot, the submarine. These Untersee boats were cheaper, they could sink any number of foreign battleships without even being detected, and the Germans made tons of them. Now, not surprisingly, the British did not like all of this competition from these new German ships, and it upset that balance of power. And it was the only way for Britain to maintain its naval superiority was to build more ships of their own, which they totally did. And this led the Germans to build more ships, which led the British to build more. And that, my friends, is how you get a naval arms race. Pretty soon, the rivalry was so large that other nations in Europe started choosing sides for the war that would inevitably follow. And so they made secret defensive alliances with the British or German governments. And each of these words is important. First, they were alliances, which meant I've got your back. But they were defensive alliances, which meant I've only got your back if you get attacked first. And of course, they were secret, which meant I've got your back if you get attacked first, but up until that point, I'll deny having anything to do with you. And so, by 1914, Europe was armed and allied, a powder keg about to explode. But what would provide that spark? Well, it would be the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, this isn't AP European history, so we won't dwell upon this too much. Suffice it to say, that when a pro-Serbian, you see them on the map there, a group called the Black Hand murdered the Prince of Austria-Hungary, let's just say that Austria-Hungary didn't take it too well. It felt that Serbia had attacked it, which it had, and it triggered the secret defensive alliance with Germany. And so when asked if they would have their back, Germany said, yeah, you're right, we've got your back, you totally just got attacked. And then when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, that triggered Serbia's defensive alliance with Russia, which of course then triggered it with France and then eventually with Britain. And pretty soon, all of Europe was at war with itself. And because many of these countries had colonies, that meant that everywhere from Australia to South Africa to French Indochina was involved in this conflict, hence the term World War. And here we see all of these secret defensive alliances and how they would all come into conflict with each other after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Now, at this moment, let's go, before we go any further, I'd like you to take a minute to ask yourself this question. Who is to blame for this war? If you were to take a pie and slice it up into different sized pieces based upon which country is most to blame, answer this. Which countries would get the biggest slices of blame pie? Delicious blame pie. Maybe it would be Serbia, because of the Black Hand, or Austria-Hungary for declaring war, or Germany for backing them up, or Russia for backing Serbia up. Surely they would bear some of the responsibility, but how might you slice the blame pie? Well, even if your blame pie isn't sliced exactly the same way as mine, or your brother's, or your dog's, one thing is absolutely clear. It's complicated. No one country is 100% to blame for this war. And it's really important that you remember that. No one country is 100% to blame for this war. I feel like that's going to come back to haunt us. Okay, well, I kind of lied. I think we do need a little bit more European history just before we get into this, right? With Germany and its allies constituting the Central Powers here, they were forced into fighting a two-front war, one in the east against Russia and one in the west against Britain and France. Now, unfortunately for Germany, there could be no quick invasions or conquering of huge swaths of land, and the war would quickly devolve into a stalemate on both fronts in the west and in the east, with the two sides blasting away at each other, killing millions of people in the process, but unable to make any real meaningful progress. And so the result of this was ongoing stalemate and deaths after deaths after deaths that all meant nothing. So why couldn't either side advance? Well, primarily because the technology of killing had become so efficient by World War I that any troops trying to charge would simply get mowed down by the opposing side. Machine guns cut a swath through the armies, and mechanized artillery was put on treads that could roll over anything, and thus the first tanks were introduced into the battlefield. In the air, warplanes would fly over enemy encampments and drop bombs, and if that didn't work, then armies would lob canisters of poison gas at each other, suffocating their enemy if they couldn't shoot them. Now, given all of these advances in the art of human slaughter, armies resorted to the most primitive of defenses, digging a hole in the ground and hiding in it. And indeed, trench warfare came to be the defining feature of World War I battlefields. And the movie 1917 depicts this pretty spectacularly. I recommend it highly. Well, to rally their side to the cause of war, countries created propaganda posters depicting their cause as righteous and just and demonizing their enemies. And for the British men who might be worried about leaving their families behind, well, the women of Britain say go. But what are we defending our country against? Well, we're defending them against those dastardly Germans, the very people who sunk the Lusitania, a passenger ship, murdering over 1,000 innocent people, like this woman still clinging to her child as she drowns, a casualty of German treachery. Or if that's too subtle, how about, hey, Irishmen, how many of those people murdered on the Lusitania were Irish? Let's fight back. But I really love this last image here because it's almost a desperate appeal from Britain to her special friend, the United States. Civilization is calling, USA. Wake up, America. So why was the United States happy just to sleep through the first few years of the Great War? Well, it's complicated, and it's what we'll address in part 2 of this presentation. It's like a little bit like a cliffhanger, but it's so much more. So stay tuned.